Alright, so I'm guessing you want to see the Tucker Carlson Putin interview, but when you saw it was 2 hours long, you decided you ain't watching all of that. So don't worry, I'm here to summarize it all for you. Alright, so the interviews are trending long before it even happened, with some people claiming that Tucker Carlson shouldn't be even allowed to interview Putin, which obviously is an awful take since America brandishes itself as a free country, so telling a journalist who he is and isn't allowed to interview doesn't really allow itself with the country philosophy. Now, moving on to the actual interview, I'll go through all of the interesting parts in chronological order, and there'll be timestamps on the screen so you can watch them in the actual interview itself. Alright, let's go. The interview begins by them exchanging pleasantries, and Putin asks if he can, share a short story about Russian history. Then he proceeds to give a fucking 5-hour-long Russian history lesson, and when Carlson tried to, interrupt him and get back on track, Putin basically said, "Yo, let me talk my talk, shithead." So the entire beginning can be extended with this meme. But during Putin's long talk about history, some interesting clips are how he mentions that after World War II, Poland got some of its parts back from Germany. Which to me is a shitty argument since the USSR had a shadow government over Poland until 1989, but I digress. He then says that when Soviet Ukraine gets created, Lenin for some mystical and unexplainable reason gives them the right to leave the USSR, which Putin basically says it was a mistake. Furthermore, Putin also says that Lenin gave Ukraine parts that were never Ukrainian to begin with, and he is angry about that. Some more yapping occurs, and it can be summarized as, "Ukraine is a Russian property, yes." Then they talk about the Cold War for a hot second, and Putin actually says that Bill Clinton actually offered him a place in NATO. But then, when they met up to talk about the caveats of Russia joining NATO, Clinton withdrew the offer after being overruled by his team. Tucker asks if Russia would have joined NATO if the US allowed it, and Putin responds basically,
I don't know, maybe, lol.
Now this could open a very interesting ground for speculation, but let's move on. Then Tucker summarizes Putin's story by saying,
"So twice you've described US presidents making decisions and then being undercut by their agency heads. So it sounds like you're describing a system that's not run by the people who were elected in your telling."
That's right, that's right.
Which is somewhat ironic coming from someone who has been at the president of Russia for 10 years in a row. Then, delving more into what prompted Russia's invasion, he brings up NATO coming closer and closer to Russia's borders, then NATO building military bases, which Russia did not agree to. Then Putin blabs on about that this isn't the start of the war, but his attempt of stopping it, because the actual war has been going on for years. Now, I'm not really allowed to say the words describing the German painter and his ideology, so instead of using the word Nazi, I'll use the word mustache. Putin moves on to talk about the demustachification and how Ukraine has built its entire identity on people who associated and collaborated with the mustache man himself. Now, I didn't see him mention any source of this, and even funnier, he doesn't criticize Stalin, who openly worked together with the German painter, which to me makes the entire mustache argument invalid. Moreover, he claims that he would be okay with Ukraine being their own separate people, but he isn't, because they are basing themselves on mustache ideologies. And then he says that Zelensky is a mustache man supporter. Now I must say that a common critique people had for Carlson is that they were worried that he would give Putin a softball interview, basically meaning he wouldn't ask any hard questions, which I don't think he did. And that's proved here, when even though Putin, avoided the question multiple times, Tucker really tried to steer him back on track, which I have to commend him for doing. Then Tucker asked, how will Putin eliminate the neo-mustachism in a country that he doesn't control? Putin just kinda avoids the question, saying, we negotiate in Istanbul and Ukraine is still pro-mustache. Tucker then inquires more about the peace talks, and Putin claims that they were very keen on negotiating peace, but Zelensky has signed a decree to never negotiate with Russia. Now, that statement would have been true, but Zelensky actually signed a decree to not negotiate with Putin, not with Russia, stating that because of Putin's dishonesty, he will not negotiate because it's pointless. And honestly, I see Zelensky's point. Since Putin has been very avoidant answering questions from Tucker, and has spread countless lies before, therefore I urge you to, take everything he says with a fucking spoonful of salt. Now, Tucker asks if this could become a global nuclear conflict. Putin answers that he has no interest in a nuclear war or an invasion of Poland or Latvia. And being honest, I believe him. There is little no point in Russia expanding the conflict to more countries, especially since both Latvia and Poland are members of NATO. Tucker provides a possible reason for why Russia would invade more countries, and Putin responds by saying he will absolutely not get involved with a global war. And once again, I believe him. We rarely get a straight answer from Putin, and an absolute no here makes sense. He wouldn't win in a war against Europe or NATO, so he has no reason to try. He says that the West is playing up the threat of Russia in order to get more taxpayer money, and the goal is to weaken Russia as much as possible. Tucker then asks the big question of who blew up the Nord Stream, which was the largest act of industrial terrorism ever. And Putin responds jokingly saying that it was Tucker Carlson.
You for sure.
I was busy that day. Nate, do you have I did not blow up Nord Stream. Thank you, though.
Yeah, if Tucker didn't laugh there, he'd probably get shot. But then Putin goes on to say that it was the CIA who blew up the Nord Stream, but then provides no evidence and just goes on to a huge yapping session. But Tucker responds with a killer counter-argument. If you have evidence that CIA did this, and presumably you do, why wouldn't you present this for a huge propaganda victory? And Putin just says that it's very difficult to beat the USA in a propaganda war.
Because the United States controls all the world's media and many...
And I see his point, but if he had actual evidence of CIA blowing up Nord Stream, he definitely would have shown it. For the next couple minutes, he talks about the economical impacts of war, but then is asked to describe who is on each side of the war. And I swear to God, Putin just genuinely ignores the question and makes the anecdote to the human brain. Then they go into even more economy, which I am very much not qualified to talk about, specifically mentioning topics as the US dollar, gasoline, and Putin praising the Chinese economy. Which is actually kind of ironic since the Chinese economy has been on a kind of big decline. Talking about that would take an entire hour, so here is a video summarizing it. Going back to the interview, an interesting question is asked by Tucker. The question is about the power centers and who really controls the USA. But Putin fucks up the entire question by basically saying, I don't know, lol, it's too complex. And then going back to talking about Russian history. And I won't lie to you, the rest of the interview is a huge snooze fest where the same things are repeated over and over and a couple of new interesting things are said. Putin says that Russia is an Orthodox country that values patriotism because Russia is the mother to all who lives there. Then Tucker asks how can Putin be both a Christian and a leader, since Jesus prohibits murder and sometimes a leader has to kill. Putin's reply is basically, it's okay to kill when you protection. And the conversation just goes more and more deranged from here. When Tucker asks, do you see ghosts? Putin goes into an incoherent mess where he just talks about, and I'm not joking here, he goes from Genghis Khan to Elon Musk. Damn! Then going back to more relevant topics, Tucker asks if Putin will be willing to release the imprisoned journalist Evan Gershkovich, I'm sorry if I butchered the name, and Putin basically says, no, lol. He says that Russia has done too many good deeds with no reciprocation from the West. But he also says that there are currently negotiations made by special services. Putin says that Evan Gershkovich is in prison because he was a spy, but also says that he has no idea who he was working for. Alright, moving on, because this is getting more and more dumb. Putin talks about how inflicting a strategic defeat to Russia on the battlefield is impossible, and the West knows it. And then he kinda completely avoids Tucker's entire question of how will the war end, by essentially just saying, there are negotiations being made. And after a 5-minute rant, he finishes with, shall we end here or are there any more questions? Alright, damn, that was a fucking yap fest, damn! Alright, so the entire summary is basically done here, so if you don't want to stick around, feel free to leave. But tap that fucking subscribe button, you dick.